So welcome back. In the first half of this course on game theory on strategy, you have been kind of focusing on the fundamental concepts and tools of game theory. In the second half, we are going to change tracks a bit, and we are going to start focusing more on the different places in which these tools that you learned in the first half, how are they kind of like applied in different places in the real world. And for our first topic, we are going to be looking at something called matching. Now, this is a very interesting topic and also a very important topic for which the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to two scholars who were working in this area, called Lloyd Shapley and Alvin Roth in the year 2012. And in fact, the reason for which they were awarded was for their work on this matching topic, right? And matching is kind of like a very interesting application for us to study because it includes a bit of theory, which was developed in 1960s. And then based on that theory, there was empirical work done related to this area in 1980s. And we'll see that even now, kind of like there are a lot of developments which are going on in this area, which is related to this kind of like finding practical solutions to real world problems, right? So examples of such practical problems would be how do you apply these concepts that you get from matching to thinking about how do you assign new doctors to hospitals, how do you assign students to schools, and for example, how are human organs assigned from transplant to recipients, right? So all practical problems, and we'll see that kind of like the foundation of this is kind of like, in the theory work that was done in 1960s. So it's a nice combination of like very different kind of like ideas. And so for that, we think like it's a very appropriate topic to kind of like start thinking about what are the places where game theory is applied, right? So what we are going to do this week is we are going to be focusing for a long time on kind of like figuring out what are the foundational ideas in this area of matching, right? So we'll start with a work by Shapley and another scholar called Gale, which was this theory that was developed in 1960s. And after we have understood the basics of kind of like the theory of matching, we'll see that, how kind of like this was applied to studying the empirical work as well as the practical solutions that came on later, right? So in 1962, this is the starting point of the theory of matching for us. There was a paper that came out, which was written by two scholars, David Gale and Lloyd Shapley, who were working at that time at Rand Corporation. And the paper had a very strange title, right? So the paper's title was College Admissions and the Stability of Marriage. Now, this already kind of like raised quite a few eyebrows because, you would not think that these two things are kind of like connected, right? How is like, for example, college admissions related to stability of marriage, right? But kind of like you'll see that, interestingly, there are kind of like similarities in both of the problems that they were studying. Now, it's not, so these two people were kind of like mathematicians, right? Both David Gale and Lloyd Shapley. And, they were motivated by actually a very practical problem, right? So an article had come out of some time before in this magazine called New Yorker, where the writer was describing what are the difficulties of undergraduate admissions at Yale University, which you might know is one of the kind of like the top universities in the United States, right? So in the United States, you don't actually have a system which is similar to what you might have seen in India, where basically you just give the exam and on the basis of that exam, students are ranked, and on the basis of that, offers are given to them by different institutes. So what happens is that you do have some kind of like exams. So you have the SAT exam, for example, and other exams, but you also have like other components of the application, right? So where you kind of like list out your academic and non-academic achievements. And then you also kind of like specify the reasons for which you want to kind of like go and study in a particular university, right? And on the basis of that, the university kind of like thinks about whether it wants to give an offer to you or not, right? So you have a situation where you have a more multidimensional idea of like what a student's attributes are. And then on the basis of that, students are applying to universities. And on the basis of this applications that the universities receive, then the admission officers in different universities have to think about, who to give the offer to, right? The problem was that kind of like students had an incentive to not necessarily be truthful about which particular universities they would actually eventually end up joining if several universities ended up offering, right? So whenever kind of like students were sending an application, they would kind of pretend that this university was their top choice, right? And then kind of like the admission officers already knew that, based on past experience, this is not necessarily the case, that even if you give an offer to somebody who says that, they are their best choice, that student would apply, right? So you're not really kind of like sure from an admission perspective about which of the applicants are actually serious about enrolling if an offer was received, right? So you have basically, you can already see an element of like the things that you had seen studied in the first part of the course, where you have got students who have reasons to manipulate, not state clearly what is their actual preferences over the universities, right? And this already kind of like creates complications for the admissions officer, because at this point, because you know that a lot of students are kind of like not being truthful about what is their top choice, then they would end up having to enroll too many students, because they know that, you know, if they give, let's say, 7 offers, it's not necessarily the case that all the 7 students would kind of like join in, right? Because some of the students would have actually kind of like misstated that, you know, this university is my top choice. So, you know, even if you get an offer, then they are not joining. So in order to kind of like think about, okay, so that no seats are vacant, you would end up kind of like giving too many offers, right? And so the whole process ends up becoming a guessing game, right? Where the students are left guessing, okay, are the universities going to actually kind of like, you know, give them an offer or not? And the universities are also kind of like left guessing that even if an offer is given, whether the students are going to join or not, right? So there was a general feeling that the actual enrollments that ended up happening were far from optimal, in the sense that, you know, not necessarily the best sort of matching between the universities and the students were going on, right? So this was the background from which Gale and Shapley started thinking about, okay, how do you think about matching in general, in abstract, right? So as we'll kind of like see, they kind of like not only defined what would be a good concept of matching here, right? But they will also start thinking about, you know, what are the good desirable properties that we want in any pairings, right? And they also showed, and we'll see this result, that stable matching between students and universities always exists. So what does stability of a matching mean? So this is something that we will discuss extensively. For now, just think of it as, you know, this is a desirable property that we want in any matching, in any allocation of students to universities, right? Now, you know, this was kind of like a theoretical work. And as you might know, already have seen in your other courses, whenever you're doing theoretical work, it's always a good idea to begin with like the simplest possible case, where you can kind of like understand what are the role of the different components. And so they started with the unrealistic case, clearly, in which there are exactly n number of universities and n number of applicants, and each university has exactly one vacancy. Now, clearly, as you would imagine that, you know, typically universities do not have only one vacancy, right? They have many more kind of like seats that are open. So if you are thinking about the IITs, for example, you know, they have thousands of seats, right? But just to kind of like, you know, try and like make sense of this problem, they started out with kind of like this assumption that there are n universities and n applicants. Now, once you kind of like frame the problem in this way, then naturally you might start thinking that, okay, rather than thinking about this in terms of college applications, maybe a good way of thinking about it is kind of like thinking between matching between men and women, right? And hence the title of the paper that we saw, which is like college admissions and the stability of marriage, right? So they started thinking about the college admissions problem. They framed it in terms of this case where you have got exactly n universities and n applicants, and they kind of like saw the linkage of this problem that they were studying between that and the marriage problem, right? So what is the problem that now we want to kind of like study in order to get some idea about how to think about matching? So imagine that there is a community of men and women where the number of men equals the number of women, right? So this is kind of like, you know, you're thinking about n universities and n applicants. So you think about now n men and n women, right? And where the number of men and the women are the same, right? And the objective is to propose a good matching system for the community. So what that means is that you want to pair off each men with a each of the men with a woman, right? So that you have couples kind of like forming, right? So this is the marriage thing that is going on, right? Now, obviously, in order to kind of like think about whether, you know, the matching system that you are proposing, whether that is a good matching system or not, you need data about community, right? Now, data could be kind of like collected in different ways. You can think about what are the different characteristics of the men and women. You know, are they kind of like extroverts, introverts? Do they like to spend more time kind of like outdoors, indoors, and all of these things? But kind of for our purpose, we can kind of like think about a more fundamental aspect, right? Which is that you actually ask every community member to rank members of the opposite sex in accordance with his or her preferences for a marriage partner, right? This will actually take care of kind of like, you know, all of these things, right? What are the characteristics that you actually find interesting and so on? So what you would do is just kind of think, okay, let kind of like people figure out whatever the characteristics it is that they find interesting. On the basis of those characteristics and the basis of that, you kind of like rank everybody kind of like on the basis of your preferences, right? One assumption that we'll make and that we'll relax later on is that we are not allowing for any ties, right? So what that means is that suppose that there are 3 men and 3 women. So for each man, they have to say that, whether they would prefer to be with woman 1 for marriage versus woman 2 versus woman 3, but they can never say that, woman, I'm indifferent between having as my wife woman 2 or woman 3, right? Similarly, the woman cannot say that I'm indifferent between having the man 2 and man 3 as my husband, right? So they have to give strict orderings. Well, that means that they must have a ordering saying that, for example, I strictly prefer having the man number 3 as my husband versus having man number 2 versus having man number 1, right? So this is for now just an assumption to just simplify kind of like our analysis. Later on, we'll see that, this is not such a big deal. Even if you relax this assumption, the results kind of like go through. Okay. All right. So let's take a particular concrete example just to kind of like, fix ideas. So imagine that you have got these 4 men who are called Al, Bob, Cal, and Dan. And you have got 4 women who are called Anne, Beth, Cher, and Dot. Later on, we'll just call them A, B, C, D. But for now, let's stick with this, right? And this kind of like preference structures would come up over and over again. So let us spend some time trying to understand how does this table look like, right? So for example, here in the left-hand table, what you have is the woman's preferences over the different men as for marriage, right? So Anne would prefer Al the best, right? After that, Anne thinks that the second best option is Bob. The third best option is Cal, and the fourth best option is Dan. So this is how you read the first 4 entries in this table, right? For Beth, she agrees with like what Anne's preferences are, right? So Beth would also consider Al to be the best possible candidate for her husband, Bob to be the second best, Cal to be the third best, and Dan to be the fourth best. Cher, on the other hand, has different preferences, right? So as per her, Bob is the best possible husband that she could get. The second best option is Cal. The third best option is Al. And the fourth best option is Dan. Whereas Dot thinks that the best option is Cal if she can get her as the husband. Al is the second best option, Bob is the third best option, and Dan is the fourth best option. So on the left, this is how you read these numbers, right? These are basically the ranking of the women over the different men in terms of like who they want as their husband, right? So when we say that we are not allowing ties, it means that Anne cannot say that, Al and Bob are equally good for me in terms of having as a husband, right? Okay, so these were the women's preferences. Similarly, we can have the men's preferences, right? So for example, the way in which you read this table is that as per Al, if we were to ask Al, like, if he were to compare the 4 different women in terms of desirability as a wife. So as per Al, Cher is the best option in terms of having as a partner, right? The second best option is to have Dot. The third best option is to have Anne. The fourth best option is to have Beth, right? Similarly, for Bob, Dot is the first best option, Anne is the second best option, Beth is the third option, and Cher is the fourth best option. So this is how you read the tables, okay? So now we have got 4 men and 4 women. We can think about different ways of kind of like pairing them up, right? So one such pairing that is possible is that you kind of like pair Al with Dot, Bob with Anne, Cal with Beth, and Dan with Cher. You can have different pairings. This is just one of the possible pairings that is there, right? So we also have some numbers listed here. What are those numbers? So they basically specify if you pair Al with Dot, what is the, in terms of preference rankings, what did happen, right? So Al had ranked, if you see here, Al had ranked Dot second, right? So that is where you get this first 2. And Dot had ranked Al, right, also as second. So that's why you get this 2 cross 2. For example, what does this 2 cross 3 mean when you say Cal and Beth? So from here, you can see that Cal had ranked Beth second, right? This is the number here. And Beth had ranked Cal third, right? So that is this 2 cross 3, right? So this is the 3 would refer to Beth's ranking of Cal, and the 2 would refer to Cal's ranking of Beth, right? Similarly, 2 cross 4 means that Dan had ranked Cher second and Cher had ranked the fourth. Okay, so this is, of course, one way of kind of like pairing the couples, right? The question is this a good way of pairing the couples, right? So there are different ways of thinking, but the way in which we are going to think, which is the stability approach, would kind of like rely on asking this question. Okay, so suppose that you have paired people in this way. Are there going to be any couple which are going to kind of like object to this pairing, right? So let's think about it systematically. Now, clearly from here, we know that Cher is unhappy, right? Why is Cher unhappy? Because she is getting her fourth most preferred man as her husband, right? So if you go back here, so you can see that as per Cher's ranking, Dan is the fourth preferred husband, right? So she would kind of like want to go and see that, if she kind of like goes and kind of like approaches any of the other men and say that, okay, would you prefer to be kind of like with me as opposed to your kind of like what the matchmaker has paired who you up with, would you kind of like prefer to do that, right? So what are the options? So Cher can go and like propose to Bob, right? Uh, so this is Bob, but would Bob accept Cher's proposal? Well, Bob is kind of like tied with Anne, right? So Bob prefers Anne. So Anne is the second best option for Bob over Cher, right? Who is the fourth best option. So, if Cher approaches Bob, then clearly, Bob is not going to kind of like accept Cher's proposal, right? So that will not work. What about if she approaches Cal, right? So why would she approach Cal? Remember, Cal is Cher's second best option, right? Okay, so Cal was paired with Beth, right? So Cal is preferred with Beth, but Cher is the third option, right? So Cal would prefer to stay with his existing partner Beth than with Cher, right? So again, he would not agree to Cher's proposal, right? Okay. The other option is that Cher goes to her third preferred choice, who is Al, right? And Al was earlier paired with Dot, right? But we can see that Al ranks Cher as the best, right? So ranks Cher over Dot, right? So if Cher goes and proposes to Al, then Al is going to accept Cher's proposal, and then both of them are going to object to the kind of like the matchmaker's proposal, right? So this proposal that is there, this is not going to stick because you have got two people, Cher and Al, who are going to be kind of like unhappy with this pairing, and then they are going to object to this pairing and say that we would rather be with each other than compared to the people with whom you have paired us up, right? So they would object to the matchmaker's proposal, and so therefore this matchmaker's proposal will not work, right? So that's how you can kind of like think about it, right? So while the proposal was a feasible proposal in the sense that we had paired four men with four women, it is not a good one. Okay, why is it not a good one? Because the proposal is going to be rejected, right? Because you have got these two people, Cher and Al, who prefer each other to the actual mates, right? The one that was kind of like proposed, and therefore they are going to reject the matchmaker's proposal, right? So this one does not work. Okay, you can think about other ways in which kind of like pairing up men and women, right? So one way of is that you try to pair off all the men with their first choice. So remember, this was the preference thing, right? So what happens if we try to kind of like pair each of the men with their first choice? So that would mean that we want to pair Al with Cher, okay, Bob with Dot, Cal with Anne, and Dan with Dot, right? So these are the first choices. One problem is that kind of both Bob and Dan preferred Dot as their first choice, right? So then this is not going to work. So for Dan, we have to look at other options, right? So Dan's second choice is Cher, who is also kind of like somebody else's first choice. His third choice is Anne, who is also somebody else's. So then basically Dan is going to be left only with the fourth choice, which is Beth, right? So this is our new pairing that we are considering, where Al is matched with Cher, Bob is matched with Dot, Cal is matched with Anne, and Dan is matched with Bear. So this is basically the kind of like thing. Now, do you think that this proposal is going to be accepted or rejected in the sense that we discussed? Well, you can think about it in the following way. You can see, from everybody's perspective. Clearly, Al, Bob, and Cal have no reason to kind of like go to anybody else, right? They're already getting their first choice, right? Dan, on the other hand, is getting his fourth choice, Beth, right? So Dan would perhaps try and kind of like approach all of the other choices, right? So he might want to start out with Dot, right? But we can clearly see that all of the women rank Dan fourth, right? Dan is kind of like the lowest in terms of their ranking, right? So even if Dan approaches any of the women, none of them are going to accept whoever they have been paired with, right? So Cher has been paired with Al, Dot has been paired with Bob, and has been paired with Cal. All of them are kind of like going to be happier of staying with the matchmaker's proposal than to kind of like accept the Dan's proposal, right? So we can clearly see that Dan cannot kind of like, get any of the others to kind of like to object to this pairing, right? And none of the other men, Al, Bob, and Cal, have any reason to object because they're already getting their best, right? So this one actually is not going to suffer from the problem that we have. So it is kind of like good in the sense that at least it does not have that objection that we had. So you might think that, okay, now we have kind of like figured out a way, maybe we can do the same thing in terms of there's another possible matching that will work, which is that we try to pair off all the women with their first choice, right? So again, if you kind of like go through the same analysis, which is kind of like here, we can see that Anne's first choice is Al. Beth's first choice is also Al. Cher's is Bob, and Dot's Cal. So again, we have got both Anne and Beth kind of like having Al as the first choice. So then Beth has to kind of like look for something else. Bob and Cal are taken. So then Beth is kind of going to end up with Dan, right? So this is kind of like the new preference matching that we are considering. So again, one question is, will this kind of like be accepted? If you think about it, basically what you find is that there's going to be two people who are going to object, right? Who are these two people? So suppose that Beth approaches Bob and suggests that both of them reject this matching and form their own pair. Now, is this something that Bob is going to agree? So let's think about it. So Bob has been matched to Cher, right? So this is Bob's fourth option, right? So clearly Bob prefers to be Beth than with Cher as husband and wife. So both of them, like, if Beth actually approaches Bob, and Beth has reasons to approach Bob because Beth is kind of like matched with her fourth option, Dan, right? Then they kind of like will both agree that, they don't want the matchmaker's proposal. So they are going to reject this matching and form their own pair, right? So in this case, again, we have got that this matching will be rejected by both Beth and Bob, and therefore this is not a good way of pairing up the couples.